Maybe you've heard of the Knights Templar before, the warrior monks in white cloaks and red crosses, sworn to protect pilgrims and secrets alike. But what if I told you the Templars were not the beginning? That before swords and oaths and holy wars, there was something older, a brotherhood that worshipped no man, built no walls, and kept only one command: do not let the flame die. Tonight, we're not starting in Jerusalem or Rome or even France. We're going further back, to the dust and heat of Babylon, where merchants, priests, and exiles once met under a burning sky. Somewhere in that chaos, a handful of men discovered something simple yet eternal: that light could be a promise, and that to protect it was to protect all memory. If you can, set your phone aside for a moment, put on your headphones, let your eyes rest, and just listen. You'll hear the story of a flame that refused to go out, a flame that passed through hands, through centuries, and through faiths, until one day it found its way into the rituals of the Knights Templar. Because before the Templars raised their cross, there was another symbol, a quiet, trembling light, and those who guarded it called themselves the Covenant of Fire. If you're listening late at night, just breathe. Let the world go quiet for a moment. Imagine the sound of sand shifting under your feet and the distant crackle of something alive, something that moves like it remembers your breath. That's where this story begins. Not with a king or a prophet, but with a flame. It was Babylon, sometime after the Great Exile. The city shimmered under the desert sun, a maze of baked brick and copper roof swalkas that glowed like embers even after sunset. Merchants spoke in half a dozen tongues: Hebrew, Aramaic, Persian, and above them, the towers of the ziggurats reached for the gods, smoking with sacrifice and dust. But deep in the market quarter, down an alley too narrow for a cart, there stood a small courtyard lit by a single dish of oil. It wasn't grand. It wasn't holy. Yet somehow, everyone who passed by lowered their voice. That dish, a simple bowl of bronze, lined with salt and oil, burned with a steady blue flame. The keepers called it Atar, the living fire. They believed it had been lit from the same spark that burned in the temples of Persia, the same one the Hebrews carried in their hearts when they left Jerusalem, and the same one that would one day guide the caravans west. To them, this wasn't worship. It was memory. Every night, two men stood watch. One guarded the oil, the other guarded the wind. Because to them, truth, like fire, always needed two: the one who speaks and the one who protects. They called themselves nothing, had no titles, no temple, no scripture, only three rules whispered across generations. Let no flame die before its time. Let no man carry the light alone, and let the untrained hand never touch the sacred fire. To an outsider, it was just superstition. But in Babylon, the world ran on superstition, and sometimes superstition kept you alive. When merchants from Phoenicia came to buy oil and incense, they noticed something strange. At each way station along the desert route, they saw the same kind of lamp, shallow, round, marked by a single curve carved like the letter S. The scent of the oil was always the same, olive mixed with resin. To those who knew the signs, it meant safety. The caravans that followed that smell could travel farther, trade deeper, and trust the next campfire on the horizon. Without knowing it, these merchants were following the first map of an invisible network, a chain of trust bound not by paper or words, but by flame. Centuries later, historians would argue that this was nonsense. That fire couldn't travel as a symbol across cultures. That religion, not ritual, moved people. But they were wrong. Rituals survive precisely because they don't shout. They hide in gestures, in repetition, in the quiet things people do when nobody's watching. And that's exactly how the Covenant began. Not as a revolution, but as a habit. Somewhere near the Euphrates, a scribe scratched a small mark in clay, a circle with 3 lines inside it. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even art. But to those who had seen the courtyard flame, it meant, this place knows how to keep the light alive. And maybe that's the most human thing of all, to hold something fragile, to pass it on, and to hope it outlives you. So if you ever find yourself walking under a silent sky and you catch the faint scent of resin and olive oil in the air, it could just be coincidence. Or maybe, just maybe, the Covenant never died. It's only waiting for someone to remember how to hold the fire again. Night in Babylon never truly slept. The heat sank into the clay walls. The oil lamps hissed, and somewhere beyond the gardens, a jackal cried out into the emptiness. But within that narrow courtyard, the one lit by a single blue flame, something older than empire was taking shape. The men who guarded the flame were not priests. They were refugees of belief. One came from Judea, his temple burned. Another from Persia, fleeing the fall of Magi sanctuaries. A third had Phoenician salt crusted into his beard. They spoke no common language, but all of them understood ritual. They called it the Covenant of Fire, a bond not written in ink or blood, but in breath and heat. Each night began with silence. Then, the keeper dipped his fingers into a bowl of olive oil mixed with resin, rubbed them against a linen wick, and whispered the 3 laws. So quietly, the words almost blended into the sound of burning. Never let it die. Never stand alone before it. Never light what you do not understand. Those 3 rules were enough to carry 1,000 meanings, because they weren't about fire at all. They were about trust. The flame was only a language, a way to mark those who could keep a promise without writing it down. From the rooftops, Babylon glowed like a constellation trapped on Earth. But if you looked closer, you'd notice that some fires burned differently. Some were golden, others pale blue, but the Covenant's flames were always steady, almost still, as if afraid to breathe too deeply and betray themselves. They said that was how you could recognize a true keeper, by the way his light refused to flicker even when the wind rose. There were stories, too, that the oil they used was mixed with tears from the Dead Sea, that the wick was woven from cloth once used in Solomon's temple. No one knew what was true, and maybe it didn't matter. Symbols survive not because they're real, but because they feel real. A new initiate would train his senses in darkness. He would learn the scent of true olive oil versus spoiled. He would inhale to taste whether a flame had been touched by corruption. Too much resin, too much salt. It wasn't mysticism. It was skill disguised as faith. And so the Covenant spread, quietly, like perfume carried on sandstorms. From Babylon's courtyards, to Phoenician ships, to Jewish exiles who still dreamt of a temple that no longer stood. Everywhere the flame went, it changed form, but never its heart. When traders crossed the desert, they would stop at way stations looking for a bowl carved with the curved mark of fire, the letter that looked like a snake or the shape of a breath. If the mark was right, and the oil smelled of resin and olive, they would know. This place is safe. Someone here remembers the oath. That was how the first invisible network was born, not of parchment or soldiers, but of people who knew how to recognize the same light in the dark. Centuries later, archaeologists would find strange marks on fragments of clay near the Euphrates, circles with 3 lines running through them. half faded by time. Some claimed they were counting tallies, or maker's marks, or signs of trade. But perhaps they were something else. A code of the covenant, whispering across history. We are still keeping the fire. Because the real miracle of fire isn't that it burns. It's that you can share it, hand it to another, and still keep your own flame alive. That was the covenant's secret, and maybe its warning. For soon the world would grow larger. The caravans would stretch westward, and the only way to keep the flame alive would be to hide it. Inside books, inside symbols, inside faith itself. The journey to Alexandria was about to begin. And there, the fire would learn to think. The road from Babylon to Egypt was less a road than a scar, cut deep through sand and salt, drawn by centuries of footsteps that refused to fade. Caravans moved slowly there, their bells jingling like tired prayers, each camel carrying more than spices or silk. They carried belief. Among the traders and nomads, a rumor had begun to spread. They spoke of those who walked with the fire, men who could find water in the dark, who never lost their way, whose camps never burned too brightly nor too dim. If you followed the scent of resin and olive oil, the whisper said, you would find them. And wherever they stopped, peace followed for a night. The covenant of fire had left Babylon, but it had not left its purpose. They no longer guarded a single flame in a single bowl. They carried dozens now, hidden in small clay lamps packed inside jars of grain or cloth. At night, they would dig shallow pits, shield the lamps with stones, and let the faint blue light breathe through cracks in the earth. To anyone else, it looked like the ground itself was glowing. But there was a reason for the secrecy. Fire could unite, but it could also betray. Too many priests, too many kings wanted control over it. To them, fire meant power, the light of the gods, the proof of divine favor. For the covenant, it was something humbler, yet far more dangerous. It was memory itself. A flame could outlive a dynasty, and that made it treason. In the hush of desert nights, they built something new, a network of trusted stations, each marked not by walls, but by symbols, 3 short lines carved into stone, a faint spiral drawn with ash. It was the first secret language of the travelers. If you saw the sign, you could rest, eat, and speak without fear. It was said that thieves avoided these places, and soldiers passed them by, as if the desert itself had drawn an invisible border around them. At one of these way stations, a Phoenician trader named Adoniram kept a lamp unlike any other. The flame burned low, but never went out. When asked what oil he used, he would smile and answer, "One drop from Babylon, one from Jerusalem, one from the Nile." No one knew if it was poetry or truth, but they remembered it, and the line was carried across generations, until one day it would resurface, inscribed in Latin, within the writings of the Templars. Tres fontes, una lux. 3 sources, 1 light. Somewhere along the coast, the covenant changed again. In Tyre, they began carving their symbol into trade seals. In Gaza, they taught scribes to hide it in the corners of manuscripts. And by the time the fire reached Egypt, it had learned how to disguise itself inside words. Alexandria welcomed them, like all exiles, with curiosity and suspicion. There, knowledge was another kind of flame, and the city itself seemed alive with it. Scrolls, papyrus, stars mapped onto marble floors. It was in those libraries and markets that the covenant met a new kind of guardian, the scribe. Men and women who did not wield swords or spears, but ink and patience. They didn't light fires in courtyards anymore. They drew them on paper. For the first time, the covenant understood that flame could live not only in oil, but in ideas. A written word, like fire, could pass from one mind to another without losing its light. And so the keepers began to write. They translated chants into Aramaic, glyphs into Greek, and taught those who were willing to see the same truth, that light was not holy because it came from heaven, but because it survived the night. As the waves of the Mediterranean whispered against the docks of Alexandria, one of the keepers wrote in his journal, "When men forget the flame, the page will remember, and somewhere far in the future, that page would fall into the hands of a brotherhood who called themselves Knights of the Temple. But before that, before the swords, before the oaths, the covenant would face its first trial. Because what burns too brightly always attracts the wind." In Alexandria, knowledge was worshipped like a god. Ships arrived from every corner of the known world, their holds heavy with papyrus and clay tablets, their crews whispering of kings and conquests. But among them, hidden inside crates of frankincense and salt, came something that no inventory listed: the fire of Babylon. The covenant's flame had crossed deserts and borders. Now, it entered the heart of the greatest library on earth. At first, the keepers were unnoticed. They blended in with the scribes, quiet men in linen robes who copied texts by the dim light of oil lamps. But their lamps burned differently. Theirs did not flicker. Their oil smelled faintly of resin, like something ancient refusing to die. And soon, other scribes began to notice. "Why does your flame never smoke?" one asked. The keeper smiled. "Because it remembers where it came from." In that small answer lay the secret of the covenant. Their faith wasn't in gods or rulers, it was in continuity. To them, fire wasn't a gift from heaven, it was a burden from history. You didn't pray to it, you protected it. And in a world ruled by priests and kings, that belief was heresy. The librarians of Alexandria prized order. Every text had to belong to something: philosophy, medicine, geometry, theology. But the scrolls of the covenant belonged to none. They contained fragments, half poems, half prophecies, written in a mixture of tongues, Aramaic, Greek, and a language no one could name. One scroll told of a flame that divides without dying. Another of a circle of men who keep the night from swallowing truth. The head archivist dismissed it as mysticism, but a philosopher named Cleon saw something else. He wrote in his notebook, "If the fire is memory, then these men are its nerves. Destroy them, and mankind forgets its origin." Those words were never meant for the public, yet they spread, whispered through the port markets and temples, until one morning, the library's high chamber was filled with murmurs. Who are these keepers of the fire? Are they prophets or pyromancers? Fear in Alexandria had a peculiar sound. It didn't scream, it whispered. And soon, those whispers reached the ears of the priests of Serapis, guardians of the city's spiritual order. They didn't like the idea of a faith without gods. They didn't like the thought of men who could carry holiness in a bowl of oil. So they watched, and they waited. One night, under the marble dome, the library burned. Historians still argue about why: a Roman torch, a civil riot, an accident. But the covenant's scrolls had vanished days before. No one saw them leave. No one saw the keepers depart. Only a faint scent of olive and resin lingered in the ashes. Later, a Roman historian would write, "The fire that destroyed the library began with a lamp that would not die." He meant it as metaphor. But what if it wasn't? Because fragments of those scrolls reappeared centuries later, in Constantinople, in Jerusalem, in the margins of Crusader manuscripts. Each fragment bore the same faint spiral mark, the symbol of the covenant, 3 lines crossing through a curved flame. The flame had learned something in Alexandria. That knowledge itself could burn, quietly, invisibly, and still reshape empires. And the men who guarded it now knew that if the world wanted to forget, they would have to hide their truth in plain sight. They left Alexandria as traders, monks, and masons. Some carried lamps, others books. All carried the oath. Never let it die. Never stand alone. Never light what you do not understand. The road to Jerusalem was paved not with stones, but with memories. Every traveler who crossed it carried something invisible, a fear, a promise, or a story they refused to let die. Among the pilgrims heading west after the fall of Alexandria, a handful walked slower than the rest. They carried no banners, no relics, only small lamps wrapped in cloth and sealed with resin. They called themselves the flame bearers. To the guards who stopped them, they were just wandering scholars. To the merchants, they were healers who used warm oil to soothe wounds. But among themselves, they whispered a different name. The covenant of fire had survived once more. Jerusalem in the 1st century was a city of contradictions, half dust, half devotion. Every corner smelled of incense and sweat. Every stone had been bled upon by faith. And in this chaos, the covenant found both danger and purpose. For the city burned with ideas, new prophets, old gods, 1,000 small truths, all demanding to be heard. The keepers had one goal: to find a place where the flame could rest. They settled near the old Temple Mount, in a small courtyard where olive trees bent like tired shoulders. Each evening, they lit a lamp in the center, using oil drawn from the Mount of Olives itself. Its light shimmered with a faint blue hue, the same glow that had once burned in Babylon. They called this light the breath of memory, and though no scripture recorded it, they believed the first keepers of the temple knew of it too, that deep beneath the stone foundations, a secret chamber once held a fire that had never been extinguished since Solomon's reign. Some said it was only myth, but to the covenant, myths were just truths waiting for courage. A Roman officer once asked an old keeper, "Why risk your life for a bowl of oil?" The man smiled. "Because empires fall faster than flames." That answer spread quietly among the city's pilgrims, and soon those who saw the small blue fire began to leave offerings, pieces of broken pottery, small copper coins, or scraps of linen marked with prayers. The covenant never claimed to be holy, but holiness began to find them anyway. They taught a simple creed to those who listened. Faith is not obedience. Faith is remembrance. The divine is not above us. It is what survives us. It was dangerous language in a city ruled by temples and titans, but it resonated with wanderers, widows, and soldiers who had seen too much war. For them, the covenant's fire was not the symbol of victory. It was endurance. And so the flame spread again, quietly across Jerusalem's lower quarters. By night, it flickered in homes and caves. By day, it slept in lamps carried under cloaks. And when the first Crusaders arrived centuries later, they found these lamps still burning, passed from one family to another like heirlooms, their origins long forgotten. But the fire remembered. It had learned to survive not by fighting darkness, but by teaching men how to live with it. Then came a prophecy, one said to have been found etched into the back of an old brass plate in Greek and Aramaic. When the east wind meets the stone cross, the flame will choose a sword. No one understood it at the time, but in the generations that followed, that single line would ignite a transformation. The Covenant's descendants would trade their lamps for armor, their scrolls for vows. They would call themselves Milites Templi, Knights of the Temple, and they would carry the old flame into a new war, not for land or gold, but for remembrance. The Covenant of Fire had found its next form, and the world was about to mistake devotion for conquest. Jerusalem, in the age of Crusades, was a city breathing through smoke. Pilgrims prayed at dawn, soldiers sharpened blades at dusk, and the air between them carried a tension older than both. In those narrow streets where merchants sold relics and dust passed for gold, a few men still gathered at night around a single lamp, a blue flame, faint but steady. They called it the memory of the first fire. No banner marked their gathering, no church sanctioned their prayers. They came from many nations, Frankish masons, Coptic scribes, Syrian traders. All of them had one thing in common, an old whisper passed from their fathers. Protect the flame, it protects you. It was here, in a ruined courtyard near the Temple Mount, that the Covenant's oath met steel for the first time. A wounded knight had sought shelter after battle. He saw the blue light, mistook it for a chapel candle, and fell to his knees. When he woke, his wounds were wrapped with cloth soaked in oil that smelled faintly of cedar and ash. He asked the keeper tending him, "Who lights that fire?" The man replied, "No one. We only remember it." That knight's name would never be recorded in any chronicle, but his descendants would form the earliest brotherhood that later chroniclers would call Pauperes Milites Christi, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. But before they became soldiers, they were watchers. They guarded a secret they did not fully understand. The keepers taught them three things before the wars consumed them all. 1. A sword cuts only what it forgets. 2. Fire teaches patience. 3. Faith without memory is just obedience. The knights didn't argue. They listened. Some began carving tiny flame symbols into their shields. Others mixed the Covenant's oil into their armor polish, believing it brought protection. And when they rode into battle, a few claimed that their blades shimmered with a strange glint under sunlight. Not gold, not steel, but something else. By 1119, when the formal order of the temple was founded, echoes of that old teaching still lived in its rituals. The Templar initiation began in darkness. A single lamp burned at the center of the room, the same symbol the Covenant had carried from Babylon. New brothers were told, "The light you see is not ours to own. It is what remains when all else is taken." Most thought it symbolic, but a few, especially those who had traveled farthest east, believed the lamp was not metaphor at all. They spoke quietly of an unbroken flame, said to have been carried through centuries, from the ruins of Alexandria to the vaults of the Temple Mount itself. They said its oil was blended from 3 sacred wells, just as the old Phoenician Adoniram had once said, and its wick never turned to ash. That belief birthed a secret inside the order, a small circle of Templars who guarded not treasures, but a light. To outsiders, they were warriors. To themselves, they were still keepers. They called their hidden chapter Custodes Ignis, the guardians of fire. Their vow was older than Rome, older than any pope or crusade. It whispered back to Babylon, to the words that began it all. Never let it die. Never stand alone. Never light what you do not understand. And though they rode under the red cross, their true emblem, burned inside their rings and hidden on parchment seals, was a small spiral flame. To them, the sword was never meant to destroy. It was meant to protect the light from being consumed by darkness disguised as faith. When the wars ended and Jerusalem fell again into chaos, the Custodes Ignis retreated west, carrying what they could. Among their possessions, a lamp of beaten bronze, its handle carved with strange marks. Some claimed the oil inside never spoiled, even after years. Others said that when lit, it produced no smoke, only warmth. That lamp would vanish into the records of history. But centuries later, in a Portuguese commandery called Tomar, the same symbol, the spiral flame, would appear carved into the altar stone. And beside it, an inscription in Latin, Lux venite oriente, sed memoria mane. The light came from the east, but the memory remains. The covenant had not vanished. It had merely changed its armor. The flame that began in Babylon now burned behind the eyes of knights sworn to silence. And though history would remember them as warriors, their truest battle was never against men. It was against forgetting. Beneath Jerusalem, silence has a pulse. The deeper you walk, the thicker it becomes, as if the earth itself is listening. And somewhere under those stones, between catacombs and forgotten cisterns, the Custodes Ignis began their greatest work. They called it Domus sub Petra, the house beneath the rock. To the world above, it was nothing more than a crypt. But to those who entered by torchlight and oath, it was a sanctuary built not for the dead, but for memory. The entrance lay behind a false wall in a Templar outpost near the Temple Mount. By day, the knights prayed above it. By night, a chosen few descended, barefoot, unarmed, their cloaks folded over their shoulders. Each carried a single lamp filled with oil, blended according to an ancient recipe traced back to Babylon. Olive, myrrh, and cedar resin. The flame they lit at the altar was said to have come from the same bronze lamp that survived the fall of Alexandria. It was no larger than a fist, but those who saw it claimed it glowed with two colors at once, gold at the base, blue at the tip. The keepers called it the breath of the covenant. No one wrote of what happened in that chamber. The order kept no records, no minutes, no signatures. Only symbols carved in stone. Spirals, wings, and a line crossing through flame, the mark of the Custodes Ignis. Every new initiate swore 3 oaths. 1. To guard the memory, not the relic. 2. To serve the light, not the church. 3. To die nameless, so that the flame might live longer than any name. That third vow would one day save them and doom them. The chapel was more than stone. It was a map. Carved along its walls were small bas-reliefs, patterns that scholars centuries later would mistake for decoration. But under the flicker of the flame, they revealed constellations, a trail that pointed west, toward Egypt, then Carthage, and finally to the far Atlantic. It was as if the chapel itself remembered every step the covenant had taken since Babylon. Hidden in the ceiling's curve was a Latin phrase, nearly invisible unless lit from below. Arde, sed non consumitur. It burns, but is not consumed. That line would later appear in the margins of Templar prayer books, always written in the same hand, always unsigned, and though no chronicler admitted to it, whispers grew among the ranks that the Templars guarded something older than Solomon, older even than Christ himself, a fire that once burned before names were given to gods. One night, Brother Mathieu of Provence left behind a short entry in his private journal. When I stood before the flame, I felt no heat, yet I wept as though something inside me remembered its first light. They say it is holy. I think it is honest. Those lines were found centuries later in a monastery library in Lyon. The page smelled faintly of oil. The existence of the hidden chapel did not stay secret forever. One day, a Dominican inquisitor stationed in Acre received an anonymous letter sealed with red wax. It contained only one sentence: "The temple hides a light that answers no pope." From that day, eyes turned toward the Templars with a new suspicion. The order's rise in wealth and mystery was tolerated, but this, an unblessed fire beneath holy ground, was intolerable. To the Vatican, light belonged to the Church, not to men. And if a rival light existed, it had to be extinguished. The Knights sensed the change before it came, so they divided the flame again, as their forefathers had done in Babylon. One lamp remained in Jerusalem, another was carried north to Cyprus, and a third, smaller still, was sealed inside a bronze casing, marked only with a spiral, and sent west with a convoy bound for the port of Lisbon. Each bearer whispered the same line before departing: "Better the fire be scattered than forgotten." The day they left Jerusalem, the chapel went dark for the first time in centuries. But even in darkness, something lingered: the scent of oil, faint, ancient, waiting. Because the covenant had learned a truth no empire could ever undo. Faith could be burned, banned, or buried. But memory was flammable too. The road to the sea was long and cruel. Dust hung in the air like a veil, and every mile between Jerusalem and the coast smelled of iron, sweat, and fear. Among the weary riders was one man who kept his hands wrapped around a small bronze vessel. Inside it, oil moved like liquid amber, a captive sunrise from another age. He did not speak his name. In the few surviving records, he is only called the Pilgrim of the West. He traveled with no insignia, no blade, and no cross, for what he carried was faith enough. By the time he reached the port of Acre, the city had become a wound. Walls scorched black, markets half empty, soldiers waiting for ships that never came. He walked through the smoke without pause, as though guided by something deeper than direction, memory itself. In the ruins of a burned chapel near the harbor, he waited 3 days for a vessel bound for the western seas. Each night, he lit the small bronze lamp, shielding it from the wind with his cloak. Its glow barely reached his face, but it was enough to keep the silence alive. He had been told only one instruction: carry the light until it finds its mirror. He did not yet understand what that meant. When the ship finally sailed, the horizon looked like an open wound, red and endless. The bronze lamp was stored deep below deck, hidden among barrels of grain and amphorae of oil. For weeks the pilgrim kept watch by the hold, whispering the old vow under his breath. Others thought him mad. But the crew began to notice that no matter the storm, no matter how the waves tore at the hull, the lamp never went out. It glowed through the cracks of the planks, steady, unwavering, as if the sea itself was guarding it. They reached Cyprus first. There, a monastery took them in, not because of charity, but because of what the pilgrim carried. In the cloister garden, beneath a fig tree older than memory, he buried a small vessel of oil, marking the spot with a stone etched with a spiral. That flame would one day be uncovered by the Order of Christ, who mistook it for Templar relic. But at that moment, it was just another fragment of the covenant's memory, hidden again, as it had been 1,000 times before. The pilgrim's path did not end there. He continued west, across the water, toward the Iberian Peninsula. Storms followed him. A chronicler from a nearby port later wrote that a lone traveler arrived drenched in firelight, as though the sea itself had marked him. He reached Portugal, a land not yet called by that name, and found refuge in a hilltop fortress that would later be known as Tomar. There, among stonemasons and foreign monks, he built a small oratory, carved from limestone and cedar beams. No one was allowed inside except at dusk. At its center burned a single lamp, the last ember from the chapel beneath Jerusalem. Locals soon called it a llama dos primeros, the flame of the first ones. And though they never knew where it came from, they swore that its light grew stronger whenever storms passed over the valley, as if the sky itself bowed to it. The pilgrim never returned east. He spent his final years tending the small flame, recording nothing, naming no successor. But when he died, the monks found his hands crossed over his chest, palms charred, yet the bronze lamp beside him still glowed faintly, the oil inside untouched. They built a small stone niche in the wall of the oratory to house it. Over time, they forgot his story. But the spiral mark above the niche remained, a symbol without explanation. Centuries later, when the Templars arrived in Portugal, they found that same mark carved in the stones of Tomar's chapel. They took it as their own. And just like that, the Covenant's fire slipped once more into the bloodstream of history, invisible, patient, alive. From Babylon to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Tomar, one flame had crossed the known world without a single sermon, a single war, or a single victory. It survived because it never asked to rule. It only asked to be remembered. By the time the flame reached Portugal, it no longer traveled by hand. It traveled by symbol. The oil had grown thick, dark, like old honey, and the men who carried it had forgotten the names of those who lit it first. But what remained unbroken was the vow, never let it die. The hill of Tomar was still young then, only a fortress of stone and silence perched above groves of olive and cork. When the pilgrim of the West finally rested beneath its walls, the brothers who tended the place knew nothing of Babylon or Jerusalem. They only saw a weary traveler who carried a small bronze lamp that never went out. They built him a cell beside the chapel, not knowing that they were raising the first temple of a new age. Years passed, and new masons came to Tomar. They carved, as masons do, the signs of their trade: compasses, circles, triangles, stars. But beneath their hands, old patterns began to return. The spiral, once a fire mark in Babylon, reappeared in the lintels of doors, the arches of windows, the mosaics of the floor. No one remembered its meaning. It was simply tradition. Yet each curve hid the same secret. The flame survives by becoming invisible. Even the walls began to whisper it. Sunlight fell through the rose window at certain hours, forming a shape that looked like fire coiled into itself. At sunset, the chapel's shadow pointed east, directly toward Jerusalem. And though no one claimed to design it that way, the masons would pause sometimes, tools in hand, as if aware that something older than architecture was guiding their chisels. Over the next century, the hill of Tomar grew into a fortress monastery, the cradle of the Order of Christ. To outsiders, it was merely a continuation of the Templars who had fled persecution in France. But to those inside, it was more than refuge. It was continuation. The fire had changed names once again. Now it lived in geometry, in stone, in music that echoed through the cloisters. Some say that even the rounded temple tower of Tomar was modeled after a Babylonian ziggurat, the house of eternal flame. At its apex, masons placed a copper brazier that caught the sun each morning and cast a glint across the valley at noon. From far away, travelers saw that flash and said, "The Knights of Tomar light their beacon again." They never knew it was more than light. It was a signal. In the records of the order, one brief note survives. We build not to shelter men, but to shelter memory. That was the covenant reborn, no longer a whispered oath in desert winds, but a silent design drawn in arches and domes. The Masons of Tomar did not copy the past. They disguised it. Every pattern was a prayer written in code, every wall a hymn frozen in stone. Through craft, faith became architecture, the safest form of secrecy. When word reached France that a new order had risen in Portugal, the Vatican looked the other way. The Church had learned to fear light it did not bless. But to the Masons of Tomar, that fear was proof that their fire still lived. They understood now that survival did not mean victory. It meant continuity. What began as a torch in Babylon had become a pattern that even the Church could not burn. And yet, with survival came transformation. The covenant's last keepers grew old. Their stories softened into parables. No longer did they speak of the original flame, only of its virtues: endurance, clarity, obedience. They turned symbols into scripture, scripture into song, and song into ritual. 1,000 years of memory began to fossilize into religion. Still, if you stand in the convent of Christ today, in the rotunda of Tomar, and look closely at the carvings above the altar, you can trace a faint spiral burned into the stone. It's easy to miss. It looks like an artist's flourish, but if the afternoon light hits it just right, it glows faintly, as if some ember deep within the wall never went out. That's how the covenant survived. Not as a relic, not as a legend, but as the ghost of a fire that learned to speak through stone. By the time the covenant's Masons reached France, their tongues were many: Latin, Provençal, Old Greek, even the traders' speech of Phoenicia. But their true language was not made of words. It was the language of stone. They carried no scriptures, no scrolls, no letters from Rome, only compasses, chisels, and patterns that had passed through hands for centuries. From Babylon's ziggurats to Jerusalem's tunnels, from the silent cells of Tomar to the valleys of the Seine. They called it lingua ignis, the language of fire. Each symbol carried a rule: the spiral for continuity, the triangle for transmission, the circle for unity that has no center. It was a geometry that mirrored faith itself, invisible, yet shaping everything it touched. When the first Gothic cathedrals began to rise, these Masons saw in them a new kind of scripture. Stone became parchment, light became ink, and through them, they could speak to the heavens without saying a word. At Chartres, the rose window burned with colors that told no biblical story. Instead, it depicted motion, fire folding inward, light reborn from shadow. The Masons whispered that it was the window that remembers Babylon. At Rosslyn, the carvings grew bolder. Vines curled into spirals, pillars bore twin serpents of flame, and one hidden panel showed a mason kneeling before a brazier, the same design as the ancient lamp of the covenant. Pilgrims thought it merely art. The Masons knew it was confession. In these places, the covenant hid in plain sight. The Church blessed the structures, never suspecting the heresy beneath its feet. For the Masons understood something deeper than any creed, that if faith could not be spoken, it could still be built. Even the spacing of arches followed the rhythm of the old vow: never let it die. Every 7 columns, a keystone bore a subtle mark, a flicker etched by the hand of a brother who remembered. At noon, when the sun struck these stones, thin bands of light crawled along the floor in perfect alignment, like a flame breathing across centuries. The Church saw beauty. The Masons saw survival. To them, architecture was rebellion disguised as worship. They built towers that reached upward, not to glorify Rome, but to remind heaven of the covenant below. Every spire, every window, every carved leaf whispered the same secret: that fire could be contained, but never extinguished. And so the covenant of fire, thought lost to time, found its immortality not in relics, but in rhythm, in craft, in memory chiseled into the world's foundations. Even centuries later, when the Templars emerged, they inherited the ruins of these cathedrals, the geometry of these symbols. They thought them mere decoration. They never knew they were stepping into a story older than their own, a lineage of builders who spoke to God through light. In the archives of a monastery in Provence, a forgotten letter from the 12th century still exists. It reads, "We no longer light fires in the open. The stone is our flame now. When the light passes through it, the fire remembers us." It was signed only with a spiral, no name, no date. Just that. If you walk through Chartres at dusk, you can still see how the last sunlight slides through the western window, pooling in the center of the nave. For a brief moment, the floor seems to burn. Tourists take photos, whispering about the beauty. But if you stand quietly, you might notice something else. A pattern forming in that light. A faint spiral that vanishes just as the sun sets. To the untrained eye, it's just coincidence. To the covenant, it's a message. The flame is still speaking. When the Crusades began, most men marched east to claim Jerusalem with swords and banners. But among them were others, quieter, more deliberate, who carried no relics, no blessings, only tools. Their cloaks were unmarked, their speech strange, and when they camped at night, they built small stone circles before their fires. The other knights thought it superstition. It wasn't. It was remembrance. These were the last keepers of the covenant, descendants not by blood, but by craft. Their fathers had carved cathedrals. Their grandfathers had built fortresses that aligned with the stars. And now, called to the Holy Land, they believed they were returning to the source of the flame. When they reached Jerusalem, the city was chaos. Crusaders from every kingdom, traders from every sea. But beneath the noise, under the broken Temple Mount, lay silence. It was there the builders found what they had dreamed of. The stone chambers that whispered of fire. They dug for relics, but found patterns, spirals etched into walls, fragments of bronze that still smelled faintly of oil and smoke. And for them, that was enough. To others, these were curiosities. To the builders, it was proof that the covenant had been real. They called the site Domus Ignis, the House of Fire. Among those who witnessed this discovery was a knight named Hugues de Payens. History remembers him as the first Grand Master of the Templars, but few mention that before he took the cross, he was a Mason. He could read stone the way others read scripture, and when he saw the spiral symbols beneath the temple, he didn't ask for treasure. He asked for silence. The Templars were born from that silence, warriors built by builders. Their fortresses mirrored the geometry of the Covenant's churches, circular chapels, 7 pillars, narrow windows aligned to the solstice sun. Even their emblem, 2 men on 1 horse, held hidden meaning. To them, it wasn't poverty, it was duality. Fire and shadow, faith and doubt, both needed to keep the flame alive. In their codes, fragments of the old vow remained. Custos lucis sum, I am the keeper of light. And though they fought wars and guarded gold, the older brothers whispered that their true task was something deeper: to guard the knowledge that had once turned fire into faith. Over time, The builder's blood mixed with that of knights and nobles. The chisels became swords, the compass became cross, and the covenant disappeared beneath the armor of the temple. But traces endured. In each Templar commandery, a single lamp burned without oil, fed by a secret mixture of wax and silver powder. At dawn, it went out. At dusk, it reignited on its own. Pilgrims thought it a miracle. Templars called it the breath. Some records speak of initiation rites where a new knight stood before that lamp and swore, "As long as this light endures, so shall I." It wasn't a vow to God or church. It was to the fire, to the memory that predated both. And so, within the holy order, two faiths grew side by side. One for Rome, obedient, visible, and another, older, wordless, passed through gestures, symbols, and silent understanding. When the Pope blessed the Templars, he thought he was granting power. He didn't realize he was also reviving something far older, the covenant reborn under the sign of the cross. It was inevitable that these two fires would one day meet and clash. But in that moment, at the height of their glory, the Templars truly believed they had become what the covenant once promised. Guardians not of wealth, but of remembrance. Builders not of walls, but of light. And so the spiral turned once more. From Babylon to Jerusalem, from Masons to Knights, from flame to cross, the lineage of fire continued, changing shape but not essence. It was said that on the night of their first victory, when the Templar banners waved over the city walls, a single torch burned with blue fire, untouched by wind. The brothers fell silent, watching it flicker, and one whispered the oldest words they knew. "The fire remembers." Beneath the Temple Mount, the air felt old, older than Jerusalem itself. The walls sweated with mineral salt. The torches hissed like living things. Every sound came back twice, as if the stones themselves whispered in reply. It was there, in that subterranean stillness, that the Templars made their most forbidden discovery. The dig began as an act of devotion. Officially, the knights were clearing chambers for storage. Unofficially, they were searching for something else, a memory, a proof that their flame had not been born in myth. Days turned to weeks, and the deeper they went, the more the earth changed. At one point, the soil became black and soft, as if it had been scorched long ago. Then came the ash. It wasn't dust or decay. It was fine, silver-gray powder that shimmered under light. When one knight pressed it between his fingers, it left a faint warmth, as though it still remembered the fire that made it. That night, the men set torches all around the chamber and found carvings beneath the soot. Spiral lines, threefold circles, and in the center, a single word etched in an alphabet no one could name. One man, a scholar from Provence, claimed it was pre-Hebrew, older than any temple. He translated it softly, Originis, the beginning. The next day they dug further and found a small stone urn. Its lid was sealed with pitch. Yet the wax bore the same spiral mark they had seen at Chartres and Tomar. It was impossible. The geometry was identical. Inside the urn, they found ash mixed with something white and crystalline, smooth like melted glass. When they held it to the torchlight, it pulsed faintly, not glowing, breathing. One knight fell to his knees, whispering, "The fire still lives." Another crossed himself, muttering that such things were not holy but unnatural. Yet the leader, Hughes himself, simply wrapped the urn in cloth and said, "Then we keep it, not as treasure but as testament." They carried it to the surface and built a small vault beneath their quarters. There, they placed the urn inside a bronze chest and inscribed a phrase above it, Custos Ignis, the keeper of fire. Only 9 knights knew of its existence. They swore never to open it again, but secrecy burns hotter than revelation. And soon, whispers spread among the brotherhood that beneath the temple lay not relics of Solomon, but remnants of something far older, perhaps divine. Some called it the fire of the covenant. Others whispered a darker name, the breath of God. When news reached the Vatican that the Templars were excavating the mount, concern turned to suspicion. Why dig where Solomon had built? Why keep silence about what was found? A papal envoy arrived months later, demanding to see their treasures. He was shown swords, scrolls, and icons, but not the vault. That chamber was sealed with more than stone. It was sealed with faith. The envoy returned to Rome uneasy, writing in his report, "The knights speak of God as a flame. They keep something burning where no flame should be." That single sentence would outlive him, and one day condemn them all. As years passed, the ash in the urn became legend. Some said it was residue from the first fire that touched earth. Others believed it was from a lamp that burned in Eden itself before the fall. A few whispered it was nothing less than the dust of angels, those who had carried light and fallen with it. Whatever the truth, the Templars guarded it as both relic and burden. They knew one thing: the ash was not dead. On cold nights when the wind howled through the crypt, faint sparks appeared along the urn's rim, glowing like fireflies, and the brothers who kept watch swore they could hear a sound, not of flame, but of breathing. When Hugues de Payens died, his successor ordered the vault sealed completely. The chest was encased in marble, the chamber bricked, and all mention of it erased from records. But those who had seen it never forgot. They carried the mark of the spiral on their rings, their swords, even on the coins they minted in secret. The fire had been buried, but not extinguished. It merely waited for hands brave enough or foolish enough to open it again. And in time, such hands would come. By the middle of the 12th century, the Templar order had grown beyond anything its founders imagined. They ruled fortresses from the Pyrenees to Acre, commanded fleets, minted coins, and guarded kings. But power, like fire, consumes what it touches. And in their rise, the knights began to forget what they were supposed to protect and what they were supposed to fear. Among the oldest brothers, whispers began again. They called it lux heresis, the heresy of light. It wasn't rebellion, not yet. It was curiosity, the most dangerous kind. A question spreading quietly through cloisters and chapels. If God is light, what happens when man learns to control it? They spoke in symbols, in coded letters, in the way torches were placed during ceremonies. 3 flames meant loyalty to the church. 4 meant loyalty to the fire. In the fortress at Tomar, Portugal, the youngest recruits noticed something strange. Before dawn, the old knights gathered in silence, carrying no crosses, only small bronze lamps. They placed them in a circle and recited no prayers, only a single phrase in Latin. The fire remembers its makers. It was not from Scripture. It was older. A young knight once asked where the words came from. The answer was a gesture, a hand tracing a spiral in the air. No one explained further. The Vatican's envoys grew uneasy. Reports began to surface of knights who refused to confess, who claimed that the church misunderstood creation itself, that the first covenant between God and man was not written in blood or stone, but in flame. Some even taught that light was divine memory, and to keep it alive was the truest form of worship. Rome called it blasphemy. But to the inner circle of the Templars, it was revelation. They began collecting strange objects, fragments of quartz that glowed faintly under heat, glass vials sealed with pitch, even dust taken from volcanic rock, anything that could remember light. In their crypts, they experimented with reflections, prisms, mirrors of polished copper. Some said they had rediscovered the breath of God, the same phenomenon that had once animated the ashes beneath the temple. A chronicler in Provence wrote of a night when one of these lamps burned without fuel for 3 days. The witnesses thought it a miracle. The church thought it sorcery. The Grand Master at the time, Robert de Craon, tried to calm the tension. He ordered the experiment stopped, the vaults sealed again. But knowledge, once lit, cannot be unlearned. And deep inside the order, the fire kept burning. At council meetings, young knights began asking dangerous questions. Why did the church claim to be the only keeper of truth? If light could reveal all things, what power did darkness have left? One even wrote, "Perhaps faith itself is a flame, meant to test, not to comfort." Those lines, found centuries later, would be used as evidence of heresy, but at the time they were simply hope. A hope that faith could evolve, that understanding God did not require fear. Then came the omen. In 1148, lightning struck the Templar chapel at Mount Hira. The roof burned for 3 days, but the inner altar, the stone marked with a spiral, remained untouched. To the Templars, it was a sign. The fire had chosen them again. To the church, it was proof that the devil was among them. The Inquisition did not yet exist, but the seeds of suspicion had been planted. Letters moved quietly between bishops and abbots. Templars speak of the Creator as if they were his equals, one wrote. Some even say they have touched the breath of God. And though no one dared act yet, a shadow began to form behind the light, a reckoning that would take centuries to arrive. For now, the fire still burned, in the lamps of Tomar, in the cathedrals of Chartres, in the secret hearts of those who believed the covenant had never died. They had turned faith into fire, and fire into faith again, but every flame leaves ashes, and soon those ashes would speak. They called them the Ash Testaments, not scrolls, not codices, but thin tablets of blackened vellum, found sealed within a bronze box in the vaults of Tomar. The discovery came by accident. During repairs after a storm, a mason broke through a wall and found the chest lodged behind an altar stone. The metal fused as if by lightning. Inside, there were 7 leaves, each inscribed not with ink, but with soot mixed with gold dust. The letters shimmered like embers in low light. At first, no one could read them. The words weren't Latin or Greek, nor the Coptic of Alexandria. But one of the older knights, trained in Hebrew and Aramaic, recognized the rhythm of the sentences. It was a prayer, or perhaps a warning. When light forgets its shadow, the world burns twice. The discovery was kept secret, shared only among a handful of brothers. They gathered at night, reading by candlelight, the air thick with wax and smoke. Each page described a ritual, a way of rekindling the breath, not with fire, but with will. One passage claimed that light could be summoned through harmony, when word, motion, and metal were aligned. Another spoke of the 7 flames, each bound to an age of mankind. At the end of the last tablet, a sentence stood alone. He who guards the last flame must not see it. The knights didn't understand it, but they felt its weight, as if those who had written it had looked too long into something divine and paid the price. In the weeks that followed, the brothers at Tomar began noticing strange phenomena. Candles lit by flint would spark blue for a moment before settling. Bronze tools left in the sun would vibrate faintly, humming like a breath beneath metal. Even the stone floors seemed warmer at night. The older knights dismissed it as coincidence. The younger ones called it proof. One wrote in his diary, "We are close to the origin again, not of fire, but of creation itself." Word spread through the ranks like wildfire. Templar houses in France, Aragon, and Scotland sent coded letters asking if the breath had been found anew. None dared mention it plainly. But in symbols drawn on chapel floors, or hidden in the stained glass of commanderies, a pattern began to appear. A spiral within a spiral. The mark of the covenant reborn. When the Vatican learned that something had been unearthed in Tomar, the alarm was immediate. A papal messenger arrived under disguise, claiming to inspect finances, but he asked too many questions about relics, about objects of light. The Grand Master, weary and careful, showed him nothing, yet the envoy left trembling. In his report, later found in Roman archives, he wrote, "They worship not the cross, but what burns behind it." Rome called for silence. Letters were burned. Priests who spoke of the light of the Templars were reassigned or vanished. But suppressing knowledge is like trying to drown a flame. It only spreads beneath the surface. Among the 7 tablets, one was missing. No one knew when or how it disappeared. Rumors said a knight carried it north, across the Pyrenees, hiding it in a monastery carved into the cliffs. Others whispered it was smuggled to Scotland, the land of the second flame. The lost page was said to describe the end of fire, how every age of light ends when man forgets the humility to carry it. One night, under the crescent moon, the brothers who guarded the remaining tablets gathered for the last time. They recited the prayer once more, not aloud, but in silence. Then they placed the 7 leaves into a smaller chest, wrapped it in oilcloth, and buried it under the chapel's foundation. The youngest of them wrote in his journal before leaving, "We are not keepers of fire, but of its silence. The day man learns to command the flame of God is the day he ceases to be his child." Centuries later, during excavations in Tomar, a bronze hinge was found, melted, twisted, engraved with spirals. No one could identify its origin. But the archaeologists noted something odd. The metal still carried a faint warmth, as if it had been recently forged, and when they set it down on a stone slab, the air around it shimmered for a moment, like heat over a desert road. The ash testaments had vanished again, but their words, their warning, lingered. When light forgets its shadow, the world burns twice. They used to say the covenant never drew a map. It became one. When the vault at Tomar yielded its bronze hinge and rumor of the missing leaf, the brothers who still kept the old discipline began to trace what they called the roads of warmth. Not lines on vellum, but a chain of places where fire behaved like memory, chapels where candles flashed blue for a heartbeat, towers where bronze sang in the noon sun, cloisters where winter drafts moved as if guided by a hand. You could start at Tomar if you like. Stand in the circular church, under the suspended gallery where knights once hung their cloaks to dry. On a clear morning, the light falls from the east oculus in a tight column, skimming a carved spiral in the floor before slipping away toward the nave. It's a small thing, just a minute each day when the sun and stone agree, but the older Masons wrote that such moments are how a house confesses its purpose. The spiral is the same as the one that shimmered on the ash testaments, a curve within a curve, never closing, like breath itself. From Tomar, the road turns north, And here the map isn't drawn so much as felt, beacon to beacon. Medieval Portugal kept a chain of hilltop fires to warn of raids at sea. Follow that old spine of signal mount, and you find a rhythm. One night in 3, the embers on certain peaks were banked with olive husk, a trick from Alexandria that burns hotter with less flame. The ash from those beacons is still darker than the surrounding soil. You can press your fingers into it, and it leaves no stain, as if the heat took the color with it. Crossing the Bay of Biscay by monastic staging posts, the line runs toward Compostela, then angles east to the great churches of León and Burgos. Each holds a window like a compass rose with one petal subtly longer, pointing not to true east, but to where sunrise stands on the morning of a particular feast. If you visit at the right hour and stand in the right place, down an aisle beside a column with a notch you'd never notice otherwise, the light reaches a brass inlay in the floor, and for one breath, the inlay glows as if lit from within. The inlay is always the same motif, the spiral, the curve that never completes. The Covenant's map isn't a route anyone could ride in a day. It's a sequence the body learns, a cadence of way stations where light and metal and stone replay the same whisper. Remember me. The Templars were practical men. They moved letters and gold and pilgrims. But when they carried the breath, that is how the Ash Testaments named it. They moved in patterns as well as miles. You could lose a letter in a fire, but a pattern repeats. On the French plateau of Aubrac, 2 little chapels face each other across a wind-thinned road. Farmers say their bells sometimes ring with no cord pulled. Bronze throbs when the air is very cold and very clear. The old rule of the Covenant says always 2. 2 keepers at a flame, 2 notes in a chord, 2 houses in sight. These chapels are a pair. In winter, the first takes the sun like a cup. The second throws it like a lance down the road. If you stand in the middle at noon, the glare is too much, and you close your eyes against what? Not brightness exactly, insistence. By the time the line reaches the channel, the map is all but obvious to anyone willing to see it. Mont Saint-Michel, where tidal light trembles up stone steps. Chartres, whose blue glass refuses to give its secret chemistry. Vézelay, where a pilgrim's porch shows flames curling at the hem of saintly robes. But obvious isn't the same as admitted. Ask a canon, and he'll smile gently and speak of piety. Ask a mason, and he'll talk of sightlines and Roman geometry. Ask a brother of the old discipline, and he'll tell you to rest your palm on the brass ring set into the choir step, and wait. If the day is right, the metal is slightly warmer than the stone. The sea crossing in the old accounts is never glamorous. A page in a Scottish cartulary mentions a coffer with cords of red put ashore in a fishing cove for the relief of certain poor. That's how you move something that cannot be named. You call it alms. The boatmen carry it like charity. The friaries list it like bread. The watchers on the headland note the fire that answers. 3 quick lantern swings, 1 long, then dark. The signal pattern repeats across centuries. When the order of the temple fell, the pattern hid in the habits of shepherds and coast wardens, then in the way lighthouse keepers polished their lenses, then in how parish clerks timed the candle snuffers after evensong. A map becomes a ritual becomes a custom. A custom is invisible until someone asks where it came from. Scotland receives the line the way it receives weather, suddenly. The Firth narrows to a silver belt, and on the southern bank a ruined preceptory keeps watch. 2 walls, a lintel, and a patch of flagged floor that still smells faintly of lamp oil when it rains. From there, the road climbs. You pass a glen where the wind hisses like a barely opened bellows. You step into a forest of larch, and everything goes quiet in that particular way pine needles teach. And then stone again, a choir loft of honey-colored sandstone, a place you've seen in 1,000 photographs, but never at this hour. Rosslyn sits in its fold of hills like a casket meant to be opened only by the patient. The carvings are abundant, ropes, vines, angels with that far look. But you've come for the knot set low in the north aisle, near the base of a pillar most tourists drift past. It appears to be a Solomon's knot, 4 loops interlaced without beginning or end. Only when the verger agrees to snuff the lamps and let dawn do its work. Do you understand why the old brothers came? On certain mornings of the year, the first thread of light from a narrow lancet finds the knot and crawls its paths perfectly, loop to loop, a golden bead racing a maze no hand drew by guess. For less than a minute, the stone seems to know what it's holding. There's a habit keepers share. When they reach a node on the map, they breathe out instead of in, a way of telling their own bodies to become room for what the place remembers. It sounds esoteric until you try it there, with the knot alive under your palm and a thin warmth waking in the cold curve of sandstone. Then it feels like courtesy. A small iron disc sits mortared into the floor just beyond, badly worn by feet. No sign, no rope. Its edge still carries shallow scoring in a spiral. If you crouch at the right angle, you can see where someone once tried to lever it free and failed. Local guides will tell you 100 stories, a Mason's joke, a Templar hoard, a portal to purgatory. The old discipline would say only this: metal remembers heat, and that disc, on certain mornings, feels a heartbeat warmer than everything around it. The missing tablet was said to speak of the end of fire, and some argue that these northern nodes are where the covenant taught itself to cool. Light without blaze, warmth without pride. Systems that pass a charge along without claiming it. If that sounds like engineering, perhaps it is. The oldest kind. Matching the world's rhythms instead of forcing your own. From Rosslyn, the pattern runs even farther north. Orkney, the standing stones. A brosh where sea mist curdles like smoke. But that is for another part. For now, the map has done its work. It has moved you from a hinge in Tomar to a knot that catches dawn in Scotland. Not with a straight line, but with a sequence of quiet obediences. Stone to sun, metal to touch, breath to place. And if you stood there long enough, you might decide a map like this needs no parchment and no compass. It asks only that the person carrying it be willing to become, for a moment, a link. By the time the brothers reached the northern waters, they had learned to stop asking, "Where is the next place?" and to ask instead, "What does this place answer?" Cathedral to cairn, tower to tide, bell to bell. That's how the Covenant's map behaves when it's awake. Not a line, but a call and response. Begin at dawn in Rosslyn, where the low sun runs the knot like a finger tracing a hymn. By noon, 40 leagues north and a sea away, the nave of St. Magnus in Kirkwall fills with a different music. No choir, just the small shift in air that happens when sun through amber glass turns dust into a slow, bright river. The window isn't large. It doesn't need to be. Its angle is such that on these few weeks each year the light throws a long bar across the nave and stops precisely at a brass boss set into the floor. The boss carries the faintest spiral scoring, warm to the touch for a minute, and then it cools. Stone answers stone. Walk out into the wind and keep going. The road crosses short grass toward a low mound older than churches. older than written names. My show looks like a hill that decided to be a house. Its passage faces a winter sun so narrow that on a handful of evenings the light threads the tunnel and stands in the chamber like a person deciding whether to speak. The Covenant did not build this. They chose it. Adopting places was as important as raising them. When the light enters the chamber, there is always someone there with a small oil lamp cupped low behind a knee. Flame without smoke. You see only the stone glow. If a keeper from the south arrived here, at this hour, after Rosslyn, after St. Magnus, they would know the sequence had been caught, carried north like breath passed mouth to mouth. The sea itself had its verses. Along the spinal coasts of the isles, bells hung where tide and weather could move them. Not the narrow, shrill tongues of town summons, but broad bells with throats of high tin, a composition luthiers would recognize as tuned metal. At certain moon-pulled hours, when wind came clean over the water, those bells hummed with no hand upon them. Far from superstition, its physics dressed in patience. Metal remembers heat and wind loves an edge. The Covenant made a use of that memory. A bell that sang at the 4th hour after moonrise meant wait. One that answered it at the 6th meant prepare. A third, on a headland farther west, meant sail. Listen long enough, and you could hear an itinerary. On paper, this sounds like code. In the world, it felt like weather. Try explaining to a bailiff that you are arresting the wind for conspiracy. The genius of the Covenant was not secrecy for its own sake. It was naturalization. They hid their timings inside things that would have happened anyway. Solstice shafts, tidal sway, the lazy heat in a brass boss after light finds it. A flame that travels without smoke is just that, a signal disguised as climate. In a little chapel at Dornoch, locals point to a dark patch on a sill stone and say it is the handprint of a saint. Perhaps. Set your palm on it at sundown in late spring. Feel how the stone is a shade warmer there because the window's angle soaks light into that one place for an hour longer than elsewhere. Someone cut that angle with care. Someone taught someone to stand there as the light fades and quietly count. 30 breaths, pass. 20, hold. 10, wait. If you've come by sea and other ships are moving because bells told them so, this is how you keep a convoy from looking like a convoy. When the brothers wrote of houses that speak, they meant places like these, modest, ordinary to every passerby, yet capable of carrying timing and meaning from one shore to another. In the notes recovered at Tomar, a margin hand uses a lovely phrase, vox lateris, the voice of the brick. In practice, vox lateris might be a chimney designed to draw so cleanly that the hearth smoke leaves no plume, no black flag for watchers upriver. And yet, seen from a bend at a particular hour, the faint shimmer betrays life within to those who know to look. No letter, no sealed packet. A house that breathes is a house that answers. The line that began with light now bends into water. Along the Moray coast, mills stood where tide turned slow and heavy as an ox. Some were wheel, some were undershot drums. A few were little more than cages of paddles. The Covenant favored the simplest, wood that rots rather than iron that endures, because simple things can be rebuilt without asking permission. At these mills, the keepers would leave salt books, bundles of thin laths tied with twine and rubbed with brine until they warped just so. From a distance, they are driftwood. In a hand that knows how to read them, the curve tells the moon's age, the grain shows spring or neap, their itineraries for the sea. A set of brined laths tucked under a stone lintel at the tide mill could tell an incoming captain exactly when a headland bell would sing 2 nights hence. Paper catches fire. Salt survives. Did they intend to cross the Atlantic? The pages are quiet where rumor grows loud. But out on the isles, a few chapels hold glass no one can source. Green with a depth that eats daylight, flecked with seed bubbles like tiny trapped moons. Old fishermen said those windows drink storms. Silly, except that a room colored that way does something strange to your sense of time. You sit and wait, and the world's hurry fades. In such rooms, the Covenant trained crews to wait for their hours, not the ports. A fleet that waits for its own hour leaves no pattern a crown can plot. At Wick, a tower with a missing bell still echoes on certain nights when the wind turns north. Children dare each other to go listen. The sound is more hum than ring. And if you're honest, it might be imagination. But it keeps good time with the old tables, and that is perhaps the point. A living community learns to feel its measures. You don't need a written order when your bones tell you this is the hour the shallow reef will lift you like a hand. A discipline that can be taught to the body is very hard to kill. There is a fair objection, and it deserves its moment. What of coincidence? Sun will strike 1,000 floors by chance. Bells will sing without conspirators. True, but a sequence is harder to dismiss. Roslin's knot at dawn, St. Magnus's boss at noon, the hum at the headland 2 hours past moonrise, the warm sill at Dornoch at sundown, the salt lath bundle under the mill lintel that curves like the 9th day's tide. When you start to see order, and that order repeats across distances and seasons, you are no longer dealing with luck. You're reading a poem written in stone and water. That, the elders wrote, is the Covenant's definition of a flame that travels without smoke. A poem you can walk. A cadence folded into coastlines and cloisters, so that a person carried within it becomes a link in a chain they never have to name aloud. Pilgrims think they are moving toward a shrine. Merchants think they are moving toward a market. Sailors think they are moving toward weather windows. The Covenant thinks in sequences, and the sequences carry what must be carried. Some nights, if you were keeping watch on one of those ridges where the old beacons once lumped their ash, you'd see nothing at all. Just stars, just cold. And then, as if the world exhaled, a lantern in a far window would wink, 3 quick, 1 long, then dark, and you would answer with your own, and the hill beyond that would answer, and the next. No word spoken, no smoke to betray. Only the patient habit of places agreeing across long distances. From here the road will turn west again, toward a last arc of islands where the glass drinks storms, and to an abbey that taught the order how to cool a flame until it could cross an ocean in men's heads rather than in their hands. But before we go, it's worth pausing on the ridge and listening for a hum that might be the wind and might be metal remembering summer. Either way, the sequence holds. On the outer edge of the mapped world, there is a kind of school that leaves no charter. It is a scatter of stone cells clinging to rock like limpets, a chapel that seems smaller inside than out, and a wind that erases footprints as fast as they are made. The brothers called such places forges, not because they hammered metal there, but because this is where heat was taught to live without being seen. Here, the Covenant perfected what they named the cold flame. A hot flame travels in tinder and smoke. A cold one travels in timing. To carry timing, you train bodies, not baskets. A novice arrived salt-streaked from the long pull of the oars, was fed oatcakes and broth, then given a single duty that began in the dark: keep the hour alive. He learned to pace the night not by clocks, there were none, but by the breath, the tide, the arc of a lantern wick, the slow eating of a beeswax taper trimmed to a rule. The rule was simple enough to learn and long enough to matter. 7 quiet breaths to each swing of the censer, 9 swings to the length of a verse, 4 verses to the turn of the stars from the chapel slit. Repeat until the slit shows the first pale seam of day. This sounds like prayer. It is also a metronome. Once the rhythm lives in muscle, a ship's watch can hold together at sea without speaking a word. The old hermits had a phrase, frigora caritas, love trained to the cold. They meant the discipline that lets you warm another without warming the air that betrays you. Firebanks are one method, a fist of embers sealed in ash, then in a clay pot within a goat skin, so tight it never smokes. Useful ash is taken from gorse and drift pine, ash that keeps its breath. But the better method, the method the covenant preferred, was to carry no ember at all. They carried recipes, flint and well-tempered steel. Amadou, tinder fungus, treated in urine and pounded with saltpeter until it will catch from the ghost of a spark. Splinters of resinous pine cut to the thickness of a fingernail and kept bone dry in a horn. This kit makes a flame appear from quiet hands with no plume, no scent that runs out ahead of you. Knowledge is the tinder, a taut hand is the match. The same logic moved from hearth to horizon. A hot voyage is a flotilla pushing on whatever wind it finds, advertising itself in sails and wake. A cold voyage is a sequence blended into weather. The keepers taught crews to leave not on market days, not when kings expect them, but on hours braided from 3 strands. A falling barometer felt in the bones, a moon that pulls the headland bell into voice, and a star that clears the chapel slit at a count you learned on a rock while the gulls watched. When those 3 line up, you step from land to water like a foot to a stair you have used all your life. No one sees you climb. There is a map for such moving. It isn't ink. It's a memory house built of things that can't be confiscated. A novice learned a route by laying it into a place he knew. A small cloister, a kitchen, the curve of a cove. The beam on the refectory table became the first reach from shore. The soot stain above the hearth became the black reef off the point. The 3 hooks on the wall held the 3 capes to pass before dawn. When he closed his eyes on the water, he walked that room. When he opened them, his hands kept the course. If a bailiff searched his trunk, he found clothes and a comb. The map was in the walls of a chapel 2 days' walk behind them, and in the mind of a man who seemed to be resting. You can see why kings feared secret societies. There is nothing to seize. The forges taught ears as much as eyes. The hum of a taut halyard tells wind speed to a patient listener. The way a hull shivers underfoot without changing depth tells you an eddy is crossing your keel at a certain angle. A gull's wing, when it locks into the wind and goes still, tells you more about the next hour than a flag on a mast. The covenant collected such small weather and arranged it into a catechism of signs. The catechism could pass as sailor's lore. It was that, and it was a timetable. If 3 signs met, gull wing locked, halyard hum softened, tide mill drum slowed, you did not need a herald. The sea itself gave the order, now. There were instruments, but they hid in plain sight. A rosary of knots, each bead drilled a little off-center, so it whispered against the next when swung at arm's length. 1 minute to a full circle, if the arm belongs to a trained man, a living sand glass that cannot spill. A cord marked with tiny nicks at the measure of a fathom, tied to a lid wrapped in tallow. Cast ahead, drawn up slow, and what clings tells not just depth but ground, shell, mud, coarse sand. The lead returns with news in silence. Even the little brass bosses set in certain naves were tools. Warm under a noon beam in spring, cool by the same hour in autumn. Calendars you can feel with the palm through a glove. And then there is the part that sounds like fable until you have sat alone with a green window during weather. Some chapels on the far coasts hold glass so thick and seated it turns the room into a paused wave. Sit there, breathe as you were taught, and the noise of urgency in the head drops. Crews trained in such rooms learned the hardest seamanship of all, not going. The cold flame teaches that delay is not failure, that quiet is not empty. A fleet that can wait without fidgeting is a fleet that arrives without being counted. Did such training carry men beyond the charts of their day? The pages neither boast nor deny. They write in the grammar of readiness. When the star of the ox rises warm above the slit, and the bells answer, and the lead brings up March sand from an ocean that should be winter, then we go. Maybe that took them to another island. Maybe it took them to another sea. The cold flame does not care about distance. It cares about sequence. One last habit the forges taught deserves mention, because it looks like nothing and holds everything. The brothers learned to bank not just fire, but zeal. In angry men, heat spills out where enemies can see it. In trained men, heat becomes attention. Watchfulness so complete it feels like calm. A harbor patrol looking for danger will miss a boat full of stillness. A court full of rumor will miss a man who does not need to be the first to speak. This is not mysticism. It is behavioral camouflage, practiced long enough to be kindness. Ships came and went. Towns were fed. A line of care moved across water and left, at most, a rumor of bells. From these rocks and rooms, the Covenant sent men inland again, carrying the cold flame into halls and markets, into languages and laws. The lesson was always the same. When you tuck meaning inside the ordinary, it travels farther and lives longer. A lit torch is a speech. A cold flame is a tradition. Ahead, the dominoes will tilt toward empires. The rule will be rewritten in iron and velvet. Orders with charters will rise and declare what they have always just learned. But if you trace the lines beneath their declarations, you will find the same cadence running. Light cued to stone. Hours braided from tide and star. Heat taught to live without a plume. After the cold flame, the next lesson was how to keep a past without painting a target on it. Paper burns. Seals can be cut from wax and pressed again. A chest is only a story with a hinge. So the Covenant built an archive no bailiff could seize, an archive without shelves. It began with a small refusal. Do not write what a mouth can carry. Do not keep where feet can walk. Memory, they said, must fit into moving things. A song short enough to cross a field, a pattern you can count on your fingers while waiting at a ferry, a prayer whose rhythm matches your step on a rain-dark stair. If a king wants your library, let him take the walls. The book he needs is already walking past him, in the market, buying onions. The forms were humble by design. A baker's score across a round of dough. One long slash, two short, one long, the mark of a route, not a recipe, cut into crust where no clerk would look. The weaver's selvage carried more than edge strength. Extra knots at intervals recited way stations or agreed-upon weights. A child's jump rhyme memorized a sequence of bells. How many peals at dawn when tide runs north? How many at noon when a messenger should step from the shade? A peddler's chant listed saints' days out of order. The odd places in the list told where the road was safe that week. Learn the song, and you read a calendar no patrol can confiscate. There were pairs, too, because lone memory is brittle. One brother kept the indices, short, nonsense-like hooks that mean nothing without the rest. Another kept the bodies, the full tales, the measures, the tricks of hand and ear. Together they made sense. Apart, each could be questioned and reveal nothing. Always two, the fire rule had said. The archive obeyed the same law. To open a vault in the mind, you needed two minds and a habit of walking side by side. They built rooms inside places to house memory. In a mill, the third step up to the loft was cut a thumb width lower. That step stood for the number 3, third harbor, third code word, third alley on the left beyond the dye cellars. In a chapel, the second window from the west was glazed a shade greener than the rest. Within the covenant, green meant wait, and that window meant wait 2 days beyond the order you were given. In a coastal town, 7 door lintels were scored with tiny chevrons. 7 chevrons meant divide by 7. The prices chalked on barrels were to be understood as 1/7 the visible number when dealing with those who knew. Everything looked like nothing, which is the best way to protect a treasure. They also trained forgetters, a vocation that sounds like a sin until you understand the trick. A forgetter's pledge was not to know certain names or dates at all, to keep only shapes. He could say, "A man from the north will come when the crows drop to the stubble," and be truthful without ever learning the man's name. He held a place for another person's risk without touching it. If taken and pressed, he could offer his whole truth, which was carefully, kindly limited. The keepers called this mercy. They were saving one another from the temptation to blurt. You might ask, can a civilization scale on riddles and knots? Look at the cathedrals that rose with no single drawing we can find. Look at trade routes that pulsed like living arteries without a map in any king's chest. The Covenant's archive wasn't a museum, it was circulation. A recipe for tanning carried instructions for a harbor night signal. A psalm tone had 3 notes that cued when to open a hidden storeroom under a fishmonger's stall. A set of bench dimensions doubled as a timetable for a winter convoy. The useful and the secret wore the same coat. Their indexers loved numbers you could touch. A bundle of 12 willow rods tied in 2, then 5, then 3, 2, 5, 3, notched the sequence of contacts along a winter road. You could carry it as kindling. A leather thong, knotted in 5s and 7s, hung from a cart like a charm. It was also a ledger of promised favors and settled debts. Snip a knot, a promise kept. Tie a new one, a future owed. No ink, no signature, no accusation if found. But 2 hands that had shaken on the meaning of those knots could settle a season without a scribe. Even tastes and smells were pressed into service. A sauce thickened with ground mustard on a feast day, when rosemary was expected, told a watching pair that the messenger had arrived from the west, not the east. A candle that smoked just a little, because the wick had been rolled too tightly on purpose, meant, hold the news, the room is wrong. Human senses are faithful archives when you ask them to be. At the center of this walking library stood a gentle paradox the brothers repeated like grace. To keep everything, we must keep little. Carry the skeleton, not the skin. Teach roots, rules of making and joining, timing and tending, so each place can skin the structure with its own custom. A southern harbor will always taste different than a northern field. Force them to match, and someone will smell the false note. But if both play the same route, they can recognize one another in the dark. There were dangers. An archive spread so thin can fade. The Covenant answered with redundancy by beauty. They hid the same instruction in three crafts, song, stone, and bread, on the theory that war rarely ruins all three at once. If a fire ate the loaves, the window still greened at the right hour, and the children still sang the rhyme. If a bishop ordered new glass, the mason's chisel kept the low third stair. If a mason was drafted, the woman at the oven still cut the slash, long, short, long, into a dozen rounds, and sent word to anyone with eyes. Sometimes a king did try to scoop up the archive. He seized a priory's rules, shook the cupboards, questioned the porters. The keepers gave him everything he asked for because everything he asked for was furniture. He went away with chairs and a ledger of grain and a handful of ropes with useless knots, very satisfied. And on the evening of the third day, as the rule required, the bells in the far village chimed 5 quick, 2 slow, then fell silent. Those who listened went to the orchard at the hinge of dusk, and the news moved past the king like wind through a keyhole. If you're wondering what any of this has to do with knights in white mantles who would one day take vows before an altar, remember that orders do not appear from the air. They condense around practices that already work. The Covenant's archive made it possible to coordinate strangers over distance, to trust without paper, to hold a line in bad weather without shouting. When a later age needed men who could keep faith in the open while their deepest work flowed underneath, the habits were ready. The shelves had long ago been dismantled, and the books had learned to walk. If the archive lived in moving things, their counting had to move too. Numbers are loud when they sit in ledgers. They go quiet when they hide in habits. The Covenant learned to count in ways a bailiff could not bag up, reckonings that evaporated when you breathed on them. Start with the simplest tool, a wax board the size of a small plate. Smooth beeswax poured into a shallow frame, browned a little by the fire. You take a reed and press 2 short strokes for bread promised tomorrow, 1 long for a wagon hired next week. When the promise is kept, you warm the board over the coals and the marks soften back into a seamless gloss. The deal is gone, the memory honored, the surface ready again. They loved this because it taught a quiet truth. The best accounts are the ones that can be erased without regret. When wax was too dear, there was dust, a table rubbed with ash from the brazier, then wiped with the heel of a hand. A thumb drew lines for sacks of grain, a knuckle tapped dots for measures of oil. A breath, a sleeve, and the debt drifted away. 2 men could balance a season of favors on a tabletop that would show nothing but a faint gray sheen at dusk. Anyone who has drawn a map for a friend with crumbs and salt knows the comfort of a plan that disappears when the plates are cleared. For distances longer than a room, they split numbers into twins, as they did with stories. A tally stick of willow, cut down the grain so that each half mirrored the other's teeth. The long piece stayed with the granary. The short piece rode with the muleteer. The notches meant what the 2 had agreed last market day. A stick found by a stranger read as firewood. Put the halves together and the bite marks fitted, truth kissing truth. No ink, no seal. If one half tried to grow an extra notch in a moment of weakness, the mismatch would shame it the next time the halves met. Wood is an honest witness when you split it carefully enough. Another favorite was a string with knots, but not the big sailor's sort that scream their intent. These were small, simple, paced like a prayer. 1 knot for each loaf you owed this house when the harvest came in. A pair of knots tight together for 2 coats to be cut at the first cold. A loose knot near the end that meant, don't forget the whisper we share about the West Road. You could wear your ledger around your wrist, and no one would think you an accountant. Of course, not every debt could be carried in bread and cloth. Sometimes trust itself had to be moved, pressed into shape and passed from hand to hand like a coin. The covenant learned a merchant's trick and made it gentler. A name could be good for a distance. A salt dealer in the hills sent a boy with no coin at all, only a scrap of dyed thread tied around his thumb. In the port, a woman who kept books in her head saw the color, saw the way the knot sat, right-hand thumb, 2 turns, smiled, and gave the boy the sacks he needed. The price was not coin. The price was the promise that, at a 3rd place, a 3rd hand would be repaid in grain. The boy slept on the boat, clutching his empty thread like a charm, and no one robbed him because there was nothing to steal, only a web of favors stretched over water. To make those webs hold, they practiced reckoning by faces. In every town there were 3. The one who weighed, the one who watched, the one who warmed. The weigher judged scales and measures, trusted because her eye had never lied about a loaf. The watcher kept the hours, ringing or counting, so the souring dough and the incoming tide both met their moments. The warmer tended the flame and the room, the human part of trust, the tea poured, the stool offered. With those 3 in place, a caravan could arrive empty of coin and leave full of goods, the value scrawled briefly on wax, dust, or bread, then folded into memory like a letter you read and burn. Coins still moved. Metal is persuasion you can drop on a table, but even metal learned to whisper. Chop marks, tiny private punches, bit the edges of silver and told anyone with the eye. This piece had passed through 5 honest hands without shrinking. The covenant's punch was a small serifed cross that looked like a flaw. You had to love detail to see it. When a purse changed hands in a noisy yard, 2 hearts stayed steady because the edges glinted with tiny proof that others had trusted this same disk of light. They also favored fractions you could feel. A round of cheese scored like the spokes of a wheel set the number of mouths the house promised to feed from its stores that month. A string of dried fish braided 2 by 2 meant, pair your people for the next road. A storm is coming, and 2s make shelters faster than 4s. To an outsider, it was pantry logic. To a keeper, it was arithmetic that walked. You may think such soft math cannot move anything larger than supper. Watch what happened when the weather turned wicked, and 100 tired men limped into a valley with more hunger than coin. The miller had grain, but not trust for so many strangers. The covenant sent the weigher first, who nodded to the truly empty sacks and shook her head at the showy ones. She laid a willow tally on the millstone, 1 long, 2 short, 1 long, and split it clean. The watcher stepped outside, listened to the river's speed, and picked the hour when the carts could cross without drowning 1 axle each. The warmer lit more braziers than strictly needed and told a harmless story about a saint and a fox, and the room loosened its shoulders. By nightfall, the men were fed. The mill ledger still showed a profit, and no page in any book recorded what had really happened. People balanced one another. Nothing here required a charter, a seal, or a pope. When later centuries peered back and asked how an order could feed pilgrims by the dozens at lonely road stations, how it could advance coin in one city against a promise whispered in another, how it could steer supplies where soldiers would be tomorrow and not yesterday, the answer was not magic. It was counting that leaves no trace. The trick had been practiced in kitchens, mills, porches, and quays long before white mantles took a vow. The mantle was a banner, yes, but the body beneath had been trained by flame, wax, dust, and bread. They made one more rule, as simple and hard as the rest. Don't let numbers rule people. Let people rule numbers. If the ledger said its pound of flesh was due but the spring failed and the orchard died, you untied the knot, you warmed the wax, you wiped the dust, and the debt vanished like steam. An economy that can forgive is the only kind that can last. Next, those same hands that learned to weigh grain against a promise will be asked to weigh blood against a road. The archive has walked, the counting has held. Now the flame that taught them patience will ask for courage against a crown. By the time the Covenant's habits had threaded themselves through ports and passes, kings began to notice something unusual. Places touched by the flame bled less. Not blood, coin. On routes where lanterns were trimmed the same way, where kiln marks matched like signatures and harbor bells rang at set hours, theft dropped, tolls arrived on time, and markets ran a little steadier. No one could prove why. Stewards wrote it in margins as a curiosity. Fewer shortages on the South Road this quarter. The beacon keepers are punctual and moved on. But rulers are hunters of patterns. Give them a line on a ledger that repeats, and they will chase the source. They started with the obvious tools of power: edicts, offices, seals. One king on a rocky coast created an official post, keeper of beacons, tasked with standardizing every fire that faced the sea. The decree sounded modern: measure of oil per night, height of flame, fines for towers that dimmed. But the lights that worked best were not the brightest. They were the most trusted. The Covenant's fires burned at an agreed color earned by reliability, by a sequence of trimmings the locals could predict with their eyes closed. The king's appointees brought brass measures and shouted orders. The lights obeyed for a season. Then storms came, bell ropes snapped, and it turned out the brass had little to do with whether fishermen risked the reef. They watched for the old rhythm, not the new regulation, and returned to harbors where a particular oil scent and soot pattern told them, home. Another prince tried coin. He minted a handsome series, lions on one face, ships on the other, and tied tax remissions to ports that used it exclusively. The Covenant's counters were not coins at all, but courtesies and timing: who poured, who waited, who arrived just before dawn so the baker's first heat could be shared without charge. You cannot outlaw respect. The prince's steward griped that payments still flowed through the same quiet hands, and shops with no sign still resolved disputes before they reached the bailiff. He wrote a memorandum recommending harsher enforcement, and, as a side note few read, a baffled compliment. Their order, if it is an order, wastes nothing. It went like this from court to court. Kings tried to pull the net. The Covenant slipped by, never claiming they were a net. Their strength had always lived in the bodies of ordinary people: harbor men who smelled bad oil at 30 paces, dye women who knew a forged purple by the way it bled on salt fingers, bell ringers who could count the silent 4 between peals to tell if a stranger was friend. Commands from above hit the surface like rain. The soil beneath stayed damp with the same slow water. The most serious effort came not from a throne, but from a chamber of accountants. They had no armies, only numbers, and they were good with them. They tracked grain, tallied ores, recorded losses. Their chief clerk did something clever. He drew a map not of roads or rivers, but of favors. He marked where debt was personal and where it was contractual, where disputes tended to close in kitchens rather than courts, where widows received bread without paying. The lines on his map did not match the king's tax districts. They matched the Covenant's routes. He proposed a plan: break the web by formalizing it, turn courtesy into contract, habit into law. Fix the bell schedule by statute, the oil blend by recipe, the kiln stamps by registry. If all the invisible threads became visible, the state could own them. The plan's flaw was simple. Once lit by law, the flame was no longer theirs. Those who kept it dimmed their hands. The bell paused a beat longer. The oil grew a shade heavier, not in defiance, out of instinct. The Covenant's core rule had survived empires. A fire is only as safe as the person who tends it. If that person fears a herald more than the sea, you have already lost the coast. You might be wondering what any of this has to do with the Templars. Hold that question gently for a moment. Watch what happens next, because it sets the stage. A drought tightened its fist around 3 provinces at once. Grain failed. Prices climbed like ivy. Panic loves dry tinder. Shouting in markets, fists outside granaries, rumors that the king had hidden wheat in the citadel. He hadn't. He had miscalculated, and pride turned a mistake into a crisis. Courtiers debated guards and gallows. Someone, desperate and practical, said, "Ask the men of the fires." It was not a flattering name, but it was accurate. Messengers were sent not to nobles but to harbors, towers, bakeries, dye yards. The ask was plain. Help us steady this without blood. The answer came not as a proclamation, but as a sequence. Lanterns along the river brightened at odd hours, signal to move barge loads at night, unseen by crowds who would swarm by day. Kilns in 4 towns fired a day early, signal to bakers to begin smaller loaves sooner, stretching stores without making it obvious. Bells marked an unfamiliar count, signaled to merchants to cap prices voluntarily, saving face by pretending it was piety. It worked. Not perfectly, no human solution does, but well enough. The king survived the season. The Covenant did not ask for reward. They asked for room. Let us mind the timing and the small stuff. Let your scribes own the paper. We will keep the pulse. It was a bargain without signatures. Those who felt it understood it, and those who needed signatures would have called it myth. Pragmatic rulers remembered. They learned a lesson they would apply again when the crusading road opened east. Some logistics are better run by those who do not shout about running them. When lords later needed a brotherhood that could guard pilgrims and letters of credit, arbitrate disputes without fuss, and obey a vow stronger than the lure of plunder, their minds slid toward a shape they had already seen. The shape of an order that is less a regiment than a rhythm. None of this means the Covenant sat in a room and invented the Knights Templar. History isn't that tidy. But the habits that would make the Templars powerful, discipline without spectacle, trust encoded in repeated acts, accounts kept in heads that rarely forgot. Those habits were already living in the marrow of coasts and market towns. When a new brotherhood finally took vows on a hill in Jerusalem, its founders would not be building from nothing. They would be laying stone on a foundation others had tamped flat with generations of footfall. The kings did not stop trying to own the flame. They never do. But some of them, the shrewder ones, began setting their palaces a little closer to the light. Not to command it, only to see by it. In their chanceries, a few clerks kept personal notebooks of quiet allies, harbor keepers who answered questions with nods, abbey salariuses who could arrange a dozen pack mules at midnight, widows who knew which baker never cheated on weight. They weren't agents. They were the small kindnesses that govern a country when laws can't. You can see how easily this flows into what comes next. A road east. A call to arms wrapped in a promise of absolution. A need for men who could move silver safely and make strangers trust them. In a century not far from this chapter, the crown will stop trying to extinguish the old fire and instead will try to carry it, freshly named, beneath a red cross. We will walk that road in the next part. For now, keep one image: a king standing at his window at dawn, looking down at a harbor where lanterns dim, ovens glow, bells mark a count only a few can hear. He does not control it. But he is beginning, at last, to understand how much of his power rests on the discipline of people he will never meet. What the king learned at the window. A few careful men began to write on vellum. It did not look like a manifesto. It looked like housekeeping. Lines about when to trim a wick, how many heartbeats to count between bell strokes on a fog-bound shore, how to settle a quarrel over weight of bread without humiliating either man. The pages smelled of oak gall and warmed wax. Margins carried tiny marks. A curled ember here, 3 short strokes there. Signposts for readers who knew that a rule is safest when it calls itself common sense. Scribes borrowed Latin the way a mason borrows stone. Custodes lucis, keepers of the light. Ordo itineris, the order of the road. There were no names to swear by, only verbs to repeat. Keep, watch, share, repay. The sentences were short on purpose, the way rope is short to avoid tangling. If the tower is dark, the harbor master becomes the tower. If the bread runs thin, first feed the hands that lift the net. If the bell is stolen, count the silence, then ring with your palm. Rules travel fastest when they ride on habits that already work, and the covenant's habits had been earning quiet trust for generations. A widow who had never seen a charter could recite 3 clauses by memory because she had lived them since her girlhood. A caravan leader who could not write his name could keep the silent 4 between peals with a precision that would shame a court musician. Paper, in this network, came last. Still, paper mattered now. The roads east were waking, and with them the old promises, pilgrims under protection, shrines dusted and kept, absolutions offered like water to thirsty men. Lords with iron wanted a brotherhood with spine. Preachers, drunk on the thought of a recaptured city, wanted guardians whose vow would not drift with the wind. Somewhere between the pulpit and the stable, the covenant's rope and bell began to look like a skeleton for something larger. The reshaping did not begin in a palace. It began in a hospital. Not a modern, gleaming place, but a set of whitewashed rooms by a gate where the air smelled of vinegar and thyme. Brothers with simple tunics washed road dust from ankles and crushed herbs for fevers. They kept a ledger of blankets, the clean separated from the worn, so a stranger could be warmed without shame. It was there that a senior brother, who knew the bell counts and the harbor lights as well as anyone born to the coast, was asked a question in the quiet way that changes history. Could these rules of kindness be hardened into a guard? He did not say yes. He said what the covenant always said. Begin with timing. So they did. The hospital bells learned the silent 4 between strokes and carried it to other houses. Way stations along the Pilgrim Road. Lamps at city gates were trimmed to the same color. Bread was measured the same way. Not to impose a taste, but to write in salt and crust a promise that the next gate would be as the last. Familiar to the anxious, fair to the weak. Men who came to lift a sword were first asked to lift a meal to a sick mouth without flinching. They learned early what many orders teach late. A hand that can be trusted with broths is a hand that can be trusted with steel. A charter appeared, like a shadow thrown on a wall before the torch itself is seen. It spoke of poverty, chastity, obedience, words older and grander than bell counts. Yet threaded through were the smaller clauses that showed the old fire beneath the new paint. The brothers would keep a common table as harbormen had done. They would settle disputes without noise whenever possible. They would not seek gifts. The road itself would create its own economy of return. And when a king or count needed to send a letter that must not be opened, a pair of brothers would carry it together, always two, as the covenant had said, because a single flame is a boast, a pair is a trust. You can feel the shape taking on a cross without the cross being named. A vow is a wick, a habit is oil, a destination is a lantern pane. What remained was a hill to pour it all upon. That hill was Jerusalem. It is easy, centuries later, to reduce that word to a banner and a siege tower. In truth, it was also a logistics problem and a timing puzzle. The city would need to be entered, held, supplied, forgiven, defended, and explained. A dozen crafts, none of which cavalry can perform alone. The men who grew from the hospital's kindness into the road's guardians began to practice what would soon be expected of them. Move silver without losing it. Cross a harbor at night without making the dogs bark. Quiet a frightened trader with a patient sequence of familiar acts. These were not military secrets. They were household arts, scaled up and sanctified. A few Cistercians, white-robed, familiar with cereal yields and water rights, visited and nodded at what they saw. They recognized discipline that did not depend on shouting. They offered help translating the small rules into a preface that bishops would bless. In the margins of drafts appear phrases that would later be quoted in grand halls, but the heart remained close to its old beating. A brother is servant first, guard second. The poor are not interruptions, but proof your house is pointed the right way. As rumors of a new order drifted north, kings who had failed to capture the fire now tried the older strategy. Stand near it and let it light your face. They granted a strip of land here, a right-of-way there. They promised immunity from a petty toll, and in return, quietly asked the brothers to keep an eye on a bridge, a tax farm, a baron with a temper. The brothers rarely wrote down their answers. They showed up at bridges before quarrels broke. They visited toll houses at sunset when men count slower and lie less. They brought a loaf from the hospital and left it where a baron's steward would see. When steel came later, its heavy entrance felt almost like an afterthought. It is tempting, in telling, to draw a straight line. Covenant to hospital, hospital to order, order to Templar. The world rarely grants such neatness. There were other threads, the old monastic rules, the hunger for absolution, the stink of gold. But if you hold the line, the covenant spun and lay it alongside the first chords of the poor fellow soldiers, the pattern matches more often than chance. Always two. Keep the timing. Feed first. Carry quietly. By the time a few knights gathered to take vows for the defense of pilgrims and the Holy Sepulchre, they stood on ground already tamped by uncounted feet. The covenant had never asked for applause. It would not ask for credit now. The light that warmed those oaths was not new. It was simply burning under a different roof. We will cross that roofline next, up onto the terrace where banners finally appear and swords are belted on. The fire does not go out in the noise. It retreats to the lamp house, where it has always lived, waiting for the moment when the crowd goes home and the work begins again. By the time the roads to Jerusalem had become a river of men, the old covenant had already changed shape. It no longer called itself the fire. It called itself service. But under every cross sewn onto a tunic, there was still that tiny burn, the memory of oil and wick, of rules whispered in kitchens instead of cathedrals. The first of the knights who came to the holy city were not scholars. They were tired soldiers and road-hardened pilgrims, men who could dig a well as easily as they could swing a sword. and among them walked a handful who recognized each other not by banners, but by gestures. The way one turned the cup before pouring, the way another paused 4 heartbeats before answering. It wasn't coincidence. It was inheritance. In the heat of Jerusalem, where candles died fast and tempers faster, these quiet habits worked better than orders. A fire lit for prayer became a marker for routes through the city. A lamp trimmed to a certain hue signaled safety for pilgrims. No parchment declared it, but soon every traveler knew. Follow the steady light, and you will not be left behind. One chronicler, a monk who rarely left his cell, would later write, "They kept their lamps like their consciences, clean and upright, and their watch was longer than the stars." He meant it as praise. He didn't know he was describing the rebirth of an ancient rule. The covenant of fire had never died. It had simply changed vocabulary. Its flame became faith, its keeper became night, its circle of light became the brotherhood of the road. When Bernard of Clairvaux later put words to this new order, Knights of Christ, poor in gold, rich in spirit, he thought he was naming something new. But in truth, he was translating an older code into Latin. In the first gatherings at the Temple Mount, when prayers echoed off stone and the desert wind tugged at white cloaks, the ritual began much like the old one in Babylon. Oil, silence, timing. A lamp placed between 2 men as they spoke their vows. One would lift his hand, the other would lower the wick. The flame would steady. Only then would they swear. And if you listened closely, past the clang of swords, the murmur of Latin, the dry hiss of dust, you might have heard a faint pattern underneath it all. 4 heartbeats, a breath, then the words, "Non extinguetis lucem." You shall not let the light die. It was not doctrine, it was rhythm. The oldest kind of memory, too deep for heresy trials, too small to notice from a throne. From that rhythm, the Templar rule grew. In their preceptories, brothers ate in silence because speech, in the Old Covenant, was fuel wasted. They lived 2 by 2 because the covenant had always warned that a lone flame draws envy. They guarded the weak not out of charity, but out of calibration. A structure stands only if its smallest beam is not broken. Even their seal, 2 riders on 1 horse, was a joke no one fully understood. But to those who knew, it was the signature of the fire. 2 flames sharing 1 wick. As their order gained recognition, priests and kings saw discipline, merchants saw reliability. What they didn't see was that every act of obedience had been practiced for centuries under other names. The timing of bells, the sharing of bread, the counting of silence between storms, and because the Templars never claimed they invented any of it, the Church never thought to question where it came from. But there were a few, archivists in Paris, mystics in Antioch, scholars in the Coptic quarter, who whispered that these knights carried something older than their vows. One of them wrote in a margin, half as a joke, half as a warning. They burn without burning. He meant that they obeyed without surrendering the source of their obedience. And that, perhaps, was what made them unstoppable. When you picture the red cross now, stitched bright against white wool, catching the light of dawn outside Jerusalem, remember this. It was not just a symbol of war. It was a memory of fire, a flame that had been handed from Babylon to Alexandria, from ports to abbeys, until it reached the stones of Solomon's temple and found its reflection there, glowing faintly in the armor of men who did not yet know they were history's next chapter. The covenant had become a cross, but even as it did, somewhere far from the noise, perhaps in a cellar near the sea, perhaps in a chapel with no name, someone still whispered the old words before trimming the wick. Never let it die. By the time the Red Cross was carved into every stone of Europe, the old flame had already begun to cool. It didn't go out in a single night. It faded slowly, buried beneath marble, treasure, and the quiet hum of power. Once, the Brothers of the Covenant had sworn to keep the fire alive, passing it hand to hand, not to rule but to remember. But in the grand halls of Paris and Acre, the sound of coins began to drown the whisper of oil. The same fire that had once been light now glared too brightly, reflected off gold chalices, mirrored in armor polished for kings instead of pilgrims. The order had become an empire of its own. Ships carried their banners across the Mediterranean, and lords now knelt where once only wanderers came. In every chapel, candles burned day and night, yet something felt colder. Those who still remembered the old vow said it quietly under their breath when no one listened. Never let it die. But the words felt heavier now, as though they belonged to a world already gone. In the commandery of Tomar, Portugal, an old knight named Arnaud kept a small bronze lamp beside his bed. Its wick had been trimmed and replaced so many times that no one knew how old it truly was. He didn't light it for prayer. He lit it to remember. Each night, before sleep, he whispered, "A flame is not made to be owned." He was among the few who understood what the others had forgotten, that the covenant had never been about war or faith, but endurance. It was about keeping light alive when the world turned dark. But power has its own weather. It warms, then burns, then consumes. And as the Templars grew rich, suspicion followed like a shadow. Kings envied them, popes mistrusted them, and beneath the marble floors of their fortresses, the faint scent of oil and ash still lingered, a ghost of their beginnings. When the brothers gathered for meals, they did so in silence, a rule inherited from the old firekeepers. But that silence no longer felt sacred. It felt cautious. Between the clang of spoons and the shuffle of boots, men no longer shared faith. They counted debts. In the archives, scribes copied treaties and ledgers where once they'd written prayers. The ink was darker, heavier, made not of soot and olive oil, but of trade records and royal seals. Even the Red Cross itself, once sewn by trembling hands, became a stamp pressed by servants. And still, in the corner of every hall, a lamp burned. No one dared to snuff it, though few remembered why it stood there. It was said that during one council in Paris, when the Grand Master signed a treaty with the French crown, the flame nearest the table flickered blue, just once, as if shuddering at the bargain being made. The witnesses laughed it off. Only Arnaud, seated far back in the room, did not. He closed his eyes and thought of the words carved in Babylon long ago. A flame obeys no king. He knew then that the covenant was dying, not by sword, nor by decree, but by forgetfulness. Still, he did what the old rule demanded. He passed the flame on. When he rode south to Tomar, he carried the lamp wrapped in cloth, hidden from wind and greed alike. He told the younger brothers, "Keep this and remember, it's not the light that saves you, it's the act of keeping it." Most didn't understand. Some nodded politely, but one, a novice barely 20, watched closely as Arnaud lifted the lamp, its glow trembling in the dark. That night, the novice stayed behind after prayers. He trimmed the wick himself and whispered the vow under his breath. Never let it die. The order would march into power, and then into fire. But in a quiet stone room, in a fortress far from Rome and farther still from Babylon, a single flame stayed alive, its light small, its meaning immense. And though no one recorded the moment, that lamp's survival would become the thread that stitched one age of belief to another. The fire was growing cold, yes, but it had not yet gone out. The rain fell in sheets that night over Tomar, washing the banners clean of their crimson crosses. By morning, they would be gone, torn down by the king's men, burned in the courtyard. But deep beneath the convent, in a chapel no one prayed in anymore, an old man kept vigil beside a trembling flame. Brother Mathieu was the last of them, at least the last who still remembered what the light meant. His beard was white, his hands cracked like old stone, and yet every evening he would descend the narrow steps with a lamp in one hand and a small vial of oil in the other. The air smelled of wax and rain and something faintly metallic, like iron or memory. He had served through the decline, seen brothers dragged away in chains, heard the whispered accusations of heresy. And still, he did the same thing every night, cleaned the wick, added a drop of oil, and whispered the vow. Never let it die. He did not say it to defy kings or popes. He said it because silence was heavier when the flame went out. That evening, the storm was louder than usual, and the fortress above shuddered under the weight of thunder. Mathieu had heard the news. The arrests had begun. In Paris, they were burning brothers. In Rome, they were rewriting oaths. Even here in Tomar, the order's name was already fading from lips too cautious to speak it. He took his seat beside the lamp, his cloak damp at the edges. The flame bent low with the draft, fighting to stay upright. He smiled faintly. "You've been through worse," he murmured. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he unrolled a piece of parchment, the last page of a chronicle no one would ever finish. Upon it, in a hand trembling but steady, he began to write. "The covenant was never ours, it was the world's. We were only the keepers of its warmth. If the name perishes, let the fire remember it." When he was done, he folded the parchment and slid it into a hollow in the wall behind the altar. There, already sealed within wax, were relics no priest would recognize. A brass wick trimmer, a bowl of charred oil, and a tiny scrap of linen that still carried the scent of olive smoke. The stone clicked shut, and for the first time, Brother Mathieu felt the weight of centuries settle over him, not as burden, but as quiet relief. The flame on the altar flickered, small and fragile, yet still alive. He knelt before it. The thunder cracked above, shaking the walls, but down here, the sound was muffled, distant, as though the world outside had already forgotten him. He whispered one last time, "If light must hide, then let it hide here." Then he blew gently across the flame. It dimmed, shivered, and steadied again, a thin, unwavering thread of gold in the dark. When the soldiers came the next day, they found the chapel empty. No books, no gold, no parchment. Only a lamp, still burning, its oil half spent. One of them muttered that it was strange, that the wind howled through every hall but couldn't touch the flame here. They left it alone. Above ground, the banners burned. Below, the light kept breathing. And though the name Templar would soon vanish from every decree, the covenant itself, older than stone, older than kings, had survived one more night.